The Cultural Role of Rhetoric by Richard M. Weaver, Part 3. The conclusion of this is that society cannot live without rhetoric. There are some things in which the group needs to believe which cannot be demonstrated to everyone rationally. Their acceptance is pressed upon us by a kind of moral imperative rising from the group as a whole. To put them to the test of dialectic alone is to destroy the basis of belief in them and to weaken the cohesiveness of society. Such beliefs always come to us couched in rhetorical terms, which tell us what attitudes to take. The crucial defect of dialectic alone is that it ends in what might be called social agnosticism. The dialectician knows, but he knows in a vacuum, or he knows, but he is without knowledge of how to act. Unless he is sustained by faith at one end or the other, unless he embraced something before he began the dialectical process, or unless he embraces it afterwards, he remains an unassemblable social agnostic. Society does not know what to do with him because his very existence is a kind of satire or aspiration upon its necessity to act. Or it does know what to do with him in a very crude and unpleasant form. It will put him away. Those who have to cope with passing reality feel that neutrality is a kind of desertion. In addition to understanding, they expect a rhetoric of action, and we must concede them some claim to this. In thus trying to isolate the pure dialectician, we have momentarily lost sight of Socrates. We recall, of course, that he did not in all of his acts evince this determination to separate himself from the life of his culture. He served the state loyally as a soldier, and he refused opportunity to escape after the state had condemned him. His reasoning in some of its lines support the kind of identification with history which I am describing as that of the whole man. There is one telltale fact near the very end of his career which gives interesting, if indirect, confirmation that Socrates had his own doubts about the omnicompetence of dialectic. When Phaedo and his friends visited Socrates in a prison, they found him composing verse. A dream he had told him to make music and work at it. Previously, he had supposed that philosophy was the highest kind of music, but now near the end of his execution, near the time of his execution, being visited by the dream again, he obeyed literally by composing a hymn to the god whose festival had just been celebrated, and by turning some stories of Aesop into verse. Perhaps this was a way of acknowledging that a part of his nature, the poetical, rhetorical part, had been too neglected as a result of his devotion to dialectic and of making a kind of an atonement at the end. Still, the indictment, too much of a dialectician, has not been quashed. The trial itself can be viewed as a supremely dramatic incident in a far longer and broader struggle between rationalism on the one hand and poetry and rhetoric and belief on the other. This conflict reappears in the later battle between Hellenic philosophy, with its strong rational bias, and Christianity, which ended after centuries in sweeping victory for the latter. Christianity provided all that Greek dialectic left out. It spoke to the feelings in what seems of a paramount significance. It had its inception in an historical fact. The Christian always had the story of Jesus with which to start his homilies. He could argue from a fact, or at least what was accepted as one, and this at once put him on grounds to persuade. We may recall here Aristotle's observation that in conversing with the multitude you do not aim at fresh scientific instruction. You rest your arguments upon generally accepted principles and beliefs, or broadly speaking, on things perceived. Practically, the victory of Christianity over Hellenic rationalism bears out the soundness of this insight. The Christians have worked through the poetry of their great allegory, and through appeal to many facts as having happened, for example, the lives of the saints. Dialectic has been present, because it is never absent from rational discourse, but rhetorical and poetry were there to make up the winning combination. Hellenic rationalism waned before man's need for some kind of faith and before a pessimism about human nature, which seems to develop as history lengthens. We have emphasized that dialectic leads toward an agnosticism of action. Even Socrates was constantly saying, "The one thing that I know is that I know nothing." The fiercely positive Hebrew and Christian faiths contain nothing of this. As for the darker side of man's nature, what can set this forth but a powerful rhetoric? Dialectic may prove it in a conditional way, but it is up to the elaboration and iteration of rhetoric to make it real and overwhelming. Dialection alone leads to an unwarranted confidence, and this evidently is the reason that Nietzsche refers to Socrates as an optimist. If there's one thing which the great preachers of Christianity have inculcated, it is the proneness of man to fall. Without extensive use of the art of rhetoric, they would have been unable to accomplish this. The triumphant and continuance of Christianity and Christian culture attest the power of rhetoric in holding men together and maintaining institutions. It is generally admitted that there is a strong element of Platonism in Christianity. But if Plato provided the reasoning, Paul and Augustine supplied the persuasion. What emerged from this could not be withstood even by the power of Rome. One cannot doubt that the decay of this great support of Western culture is closely connected with the decline of rhetoric. I spoke earlier of a growing resentment against the orator. This resentment arises from a feeling, perhaps not consciously articulated in many who possess it, that the orator is a teacher, and a moral teacher at that. He cannot avoid being this if he uses words which will move men in a direction which he has chosen. But here is where the chief point of theoretical contention arises. There are persons today, some of them holding high positions in education, and believe, in theory of course, that it is improper for any person to try to persuade another person. A name which has been invented for this act of persuading is physiological coercion, or psychological coercion, which is obviously itself a highly loaded rhetorical phrase. From some such notion have some of the extraordinary doctrines of modern semantics. According to the followers of this movement, the duty of anyone using language is to express the facts and avoid studiously the use of emotional coloring. The very use of facts in the kind of context reveals an astonishing naivety about the nature of language. Yet there can be no doubt that this doctrine carries a great danger in that it represents a new attempt of dialectic to discredit and displace rhetoric. The writings of this group contain such a curious melange of positivist dogma, modern prejudice, and liberal cliches that one runs a risk even in trying to digest it for purpose of analysis. Nevertheless, there are reasons for believing that it is in essence a new threat to fractionate society by enthroning dialectic as the only legitimate language of discourse. The advocates of the semantic approach try to ascertain definitely the relationship between words and the things that they stand for, with the object of making signification more scientific. These semanticists believe generally that traditional speech is filled with terms which stand for non-existent things, empty ideas and primitive beliefs which get in the way of man's adaptation to environment. For them, the function of speech is communication, and communication should be about things that really are. One cannot read their literature very long without sensing the strong political motivation that inspires their position. A considerable part of their writing is more or less open polemic against this feature of speech, which they regard as reflecting or upholding our traditional form of society. At a level below this, but for the same reason, they are anti-metaphysical. Unless we can establish that the world we are talking about is the world that exists empirically, then the semanticists feel we had better not talk at all. They want a vocabulary that is purified of all terms that originate in the subjectivity of the user, or at least they want to identify all such terms and place them in a quarantine ward. The attempt must be identified as a fresh eruption of pure dialectic because it is concerned primarily with defining. Just as Socrates tried to define justice or love, by now widening, now narrowing the categories, so they try in a supposedly scientific way to make the term fit the thing. The two are not engaged in exactly the same quest, and I shall come to their differences later, but they are both relying exclusively upon an accurate verbal identification of something that is by them considered objective. As Socrates searched for the pure idea, so they search for the expression of the pure thing or fact. Moreover, they regard this as having the same power of salvation as the archetypical idea. The quest of semantics cannot succeed because the very theory of it is fallacious. The connection between a word and what it stands for cannot be determined in a way that they seem to believe. They operate on the assumption that there is some extra-linguistic way of deciding what a word should mean, some point outside language from which one can judge the appropriateness of any choices of words for expression. The effort to get around language and to apply extra-linguistic yardsticks is doomed to failure, even in the cause of words symbolizing physical objects. A word stands for these things, but does not stand for them in the shape of the things. Language is a closed system into which there is only one mode of entrance, and that is through meaning. And what a word means is going to be determined by the whole context of the vocabulary, with all the intermodifications that this involves. A word does not get in through its fidelity to an object, but through its capacity to render what that object means to us. But they do not even discriminate rightly the kinds of things for which words must stand. They assume that all words must stand for phenomena, or things which are observable and classifiable by science. Indeed, this is their first principle. If it cannot if a thing cannot be proved to exist scientifically, if it cannot be classified with phenomena, we are not supposed to bring it into expression at all, except in those relaxed moments when we are telling fairy stories and the like. Obviously, they are ignoring the immensely important role of the subjective in life. There are numberless ideas, images, feelings, and institutions which cannot be described and classified in the way of a scientific phenomena, but which have great effect upon our decisions. A rhetoric can take these into account, modify, direct, and use them because rhetoric deals in depth and tendency. A dialectic in the form of semantics cannot do this because it is interested only in defining words on the assumption that definitions are determined by the physical order. Just as the physical scientist discovers a law or regularity in nature, so they endeavor to locate the source of them in physical reality. And, indeed, their prime concern is to decide whether a referent really exists. On first thought, this might seem to give them the kind of respect for the actual order that I have claimed for believers in history. But a distinction is necessary. History is not the simple data of the perceptive consciousness. It is the experience of man after this has been assimilated and worked upon by the Spirit. The appeal to history is an appeal to events made meaningful, and the meaning of events cannot be conveyed through the simple empirical references that semantic analysis puts forward as an idea. Hence it is this that the semanticist, too, is a neutralist, who would say, here is the world expressed in language that has been freed from tendency and subjective coloration. What is to be done with this world is postponed until another meeting, as it were, or it is assigned to a different kind of activity. His great mistake is the failure to see that language is intended to be sermonic. Because of its nature and of its intimacy with our feelings, it is always preaching. This type of agnostic will not listen to the sermon because he is unwilling to credit the existence of values. Yet even after it has been decided that the referent does exist, there is nothing to do with the word except turn it over to others whose horizons are not bound by logical positivisms.